You probably know Canada for Niagara Falls, the Rocky Mountains, and pristine wilderness. But there's a hidden and forgotten side of the Great White North that most people never see. Entire towns swallowed by forest and time, mining camps buried under prairie snow, railway settlements erased by the stroke of a corporate pen, and communities destroyed in moments by disaster or ruthless economics. In this video, we're counting down 15 abandoned and overlooked places across Canada. Ghost towns, forgotten settlements, and lost communities that tell the real story of boom and bust in a vast, unforgiving land. From the Yukon goldfields to the coal mines of the prairies, from British Columbia's ghost villages to Ontario's buried industrial past, these are places where Canada built, thrived, and then vanished. Stay with me to the end, because number 1 is a Canadian tragedy so complete and so forgotten that most people have no idea it exists. So hit subscribe and let's begin. Number 15, Falkland, British Columbia. If you drive into the Okanagan Hills of central British Columbia today, you pass through rolling grassland dotted with ponderosa pine and biscuit-colored rock. Falkland sits quiet in this landscape, a collection of weathered ranch buildings, a general store that hasn't seen much business in decades, and the kind of silence you only find in places people have forgotten to leave. In the early 1900s, Falkland was a bustling ranching and agricultural hub in the heart of British Columbia's interior. English settlers came here with ambitions of building a thriving pastoral community. They established cattle ranches, wheat fields, and a working infrastructure. At its peak, Falkland had a schoolhouse, a church, a general store, a blacksmith shop, and dozens of families building what they believed would be a permanent corner of the province. But that didn't last. When the First World War came, many of the young men left to fight. When they didn't return, the women and children slowly drifted away. The railways bypassed this route, choosing other corridors. The wider economy moved toward the coast. What once felt like opportunity gradually became isolation. Today, if you visit Falkland, you can still see the old ranch houses, some maintained, many collapsing slowly into the grass. The church still stands, but services stopped decades ago. The schoolhouse is empty. The landscape has reclaimed much of what settlers built, and the town survives as a quiet rural community, but little remains of the busy, hopeful place it once was. Number 14, Yubo, British Columbia. Deep in the Douglas fir and western hemlock forests of Vancouver Island, not far from Lake Cowichan, lies a place that was once defined by the roar of saws and the rumble of logging trucks. Today it is nearly silent. Yubo was born in the 1920s as a sawmill town. A logging company established operations here, built housing for workers, and the town grew around the industry. At its busiest, Yubo had a school, a church, a general store, a pool hall, a company housing compound, and a constant flow of timber leaving by rail. The mill was the heartbeat of the town. Everything revolved around the whistle that started the workday and the shift bells that marked time. Families settled here with the understanding that as long as there were trees, there would be jobs. But the forests of British Columbia, despite their vastness, are finite. By the 1970s, the easy timber was logged out. What remained was harder to access and less profitable to harvest. The company made a decision. It modernized its other mills and closed Yubo. The mill fell silent, the jobs vanished, the families scattered. Today, Yubo is a collection of aging buildings, the remains of workers' houses, the skeletal framework of the old mill, foundations where stores and services once stood. The school is gone, the church is abandoned, the forest is quietly reclaiming the roads. If you visit today, you can still walk through the ghost of the mill complex, see the rusted machinery and broken windows, and feel the weight of an industry that moved on and never came back. Number 13, Bankhead, Alberta. In the foothills of the Canadian Rockies, near the town of Banff, there is a place you can hike to through meadow and conifer forest, where the stone foundations and weathered structures of an entire coal mining town lie scattered like bones. Bankhead existed from 1903 to 1922, less than 20 years, but in that time it became a thriving mining community. The Bankhead coal mine was rich and accessible. A company town was built to house miners and their families. By 1913, Bankhead had over 1,500 residents. It had schools, a church, a hospital, a library, a pool hall, baseball diamonds, company housing arranged in neat rows, and all the infrastructure of a functioning small city. The town was profitable and busy. Miners descended into the earth every day, and coal came out. Families raised children here believing they were building something permanent. But the coal industry is brutal and efficient. When seams became harder to extract, when competition emerged, when demand fluctuated, companies had no reason to maintain their towns. In 1922, just as suddenly as it had boomed, the Bankhead mine closed. The company offered miners a choice: relocate to work at other operations or leave with whatever severance was offered. Most left. Within months, the company began tearing down the town. Buildings were demolished or sold for salvage. Families departed. By 1930, Bankhead was silent. Today, Parks Canada maintains the site as a historic area. You can hike there and see the stone foundations of the schoolhouse, the church, and dozens of homes. You can walk where Main Street once was busy with commerce. You can see the remains of the mine entrance. The forest has not reclaimed Bankhead entirely. Parks Canada maintains it as a reminder. But nature is persistent. Mushrooms grow from the weathered boards. Moss covers the foundations. Birdsong fills the spaces where voices once echoed. Number 12, Dunvegan, Alberta. If you drive north from the town of Peace River in northern Alberta, you pass through ranch country and boreal forest until you reach the Dunvegan area, where a historic site preserves one of the oldest continuously occupied settlements in Alberta. But the thriving fur trading post and community that once dominated this region is almost entirely gone. Dunvegan began in 1805 as a Northwest Company fur trading post. For over a century, it was one of the most important trading centers in northern Alberta. Fur traders came here with pelts. The post shipped furs to Montreal and beyond, and a complex economy of traders, laborers, indigenous trappers, and settlers orbited around the post. At its height, Dunvegan had a fort, workshops, barracks, trading stores, and the infrastructure of a major commercial operation. Families settled here. Some stayed for generations, but the fur trade was a resource extraction business, and like all such enterprises, it was subject to the whims of fashion, market forces, and the limits of the land. By the late 1800s, the fur trade was declining. Beaver and other furs were becoming scarce. The market shifted. Larger fur companies and Hudson's Bay Company operations consolidated trading into fewer, more efficient posts. Dunvegan's importance faded. The post was gradually abandoned. What was once a hub of commerce and culture became a quiet historical site. Today, a single reconstructed fur trading post building remains, maintained by Parks Canada. You can visit and see interpretive displays about the fur trade, but you stand in a clearing where once there was a town. The forest surrounds the site now, having reclaimed the land where traders once conducted business. If you look carefully, you can see the depressions in the earth where buildings once stood, the slight ridges of old foundation stones, and the ghost of a settlement erased by time and economic forces. So if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel because what we're about to explore gets significantly darker. Number 11, Sandon, British Columbia. High in the Selkirk Mountains of southeastern British Columbia, accessible by a rough road that climbs and twists through forest, sits Sandon, a silver mining town that boomed in the 1890s and was nearly obliterated by a single event in the early 1900s. The silver was discovered in the 1880s, and Sandon exploded almost overnight. By 1895, it was one of the most productive silver mining camps in British Columbia. The town was crammed into a narrow mountain valley, and every inch of available space was used. It had hotels, saloons, stores, a newspaper, a brewery, a boarding school, over 20 saloons, hotels stacked close together, and a population of around 3,000 people during the boom years. The sound was constant, the clang of mining operations, the rumble of ore carts, the voices of miners, merchants, and gamblers. The air smelled of ore dust, wood smoke, and progress. Fortunes were made here. Miners' wages were good. Merchants prospered. The town hummed with money and ambition, but mountain towns are vulnerable to forces beyond human control. In May of 1900, Carpenter Creek, which runs through the valley, flooded. The flood was catastrophic and sudden. Buildings were swept away. Bridges collapsed. Lives were lost. The physical damage was severe, but worse was the psychological blow. Investors and businesses realized that Sandon's location, so ideal for mining, so perfect for accessing ore, was also a liability. It was vulnerable to disaster. Confidence evaporated. Mining companies began moving operations to other sites. Workers left. Businesses closed. The recovery never happened. By the 1930s, Sandon was a ghost town. Today, Sandon is one of Canada's most eerily preserved mining towns. You can drive or hike there and find buildings still standing, empty saloons, shuttered hotels, stores frozen in time. The streets are quiet. The valley is still beautiful and wild. If you visit today, you feel the weight of what was lost. Not just buildings, but an entire world that vanished in moments. The mountains remember Sandon, even if the people have moved on. Number 10. Nanticoke, Ontario. In southwestern Ontario, not far from Lake Erie, in an area now dominated by rural farmland and small villages, there is the skeleton of what was once one of the largest coal mining operations east of the Rockies. Nanticoke was built in the early 1900s as a coal mining town. The coal deposits below were rich and accessible. A large mining company developed the site and built an entire town to support operations. At its peak in the 1920s and 1930s, Nanticoke had over 4,000 residents. It had coal mines, miners housing in neat rows, schools, churches, shops, a library, recreational facilities, and the hum of industrial activity 24 hours a day. The mines produced tons of coal daily. Trains carried coal out. Miners went underground every day, bringing out the fuel that powered Ontario's industry. Families built lives here. Children were born, grew up, and many stayed. The town felt permanent. It had the weight and infrastructure of something that would last. But coal is a finite resource, and coal mining is a business forever vulnerable to competition and substitution. As the 20th century progressed, alternatives to coal emerged. Oil became cheaper, hydroelectric power expanded, demand for coal fell. By the 1970s, the uneconomical truth was clear. The coal age was ending. The mines in Ontario could not compete. The companies made their decision. Production was wound down. The mines were closed. Nanticoke lost its reason to exist almost overnight. Most residents left. Buildings were abandoned. The infrastructure of a thriving town became the ruins of a failed enterprise. Today, if you visit Nanticoke, you find a rural area with scattered ruins. There are remnants of mining structures, the foundations of company housing, and empty land where once dense neighborhoods stood. The school is gone, the churches are abandoned or converted. The main street is empty. The forest and the field are gradually reclaiming what was built. It is a sobering reminder of how dependent entire communities become on a single industry, and how quickly it can all vanish. Number 9. Fort Nelson, British Columbia. Along the northern reaches of the province, where the boreal forest is dense and the distances between towns are vast, Fort Nelson was established as a fur trading post in the 1800s and later became a fur trapping center and settlement. At various points in its history, Fort Nelson was a real hub for the fur trade in northern British Columbia. Trappers came here to sell pelts. Supplies were traded. A small community of traders, families, and workers revolved around the post. The post generated modest wealth and provided employment across generations. But as the fur trade declined in the 20th century, and as northern British Columbia remained remote and difficult to access, Fort Nelson's importance diminished. The decline was slow and steady rather than sudden. Each year, fewer trappers, less activity, fewer young people staying. Today, Fort Nelson survives as a tiny community, but the era of it being an active trading center has long passed. The old post buildings are largely gone. What remains is a settlement that clings to existence in one of Canada's most remote regions. Number 8. Cannington Manor, Saskatchewan. In the southeastern corner of Saskatchewan, in a region of aspen forest and prairie, there is a place called Cannington Manor, where the remains of an attempt to recreate English country life in the Canadian wilderness are slowly being reclaimed by the land. Cannington Manor was established in the 1880s by a group of English settlers who attempted to build a kind of transplanted English gentleman's colony on the prairie. It included a community hall, homes built in English style, farms, and attempts to maintain English customs and social structures. The settlers were educated and had some capital, and they believed they could create something refined and lasting in Saskatchewan. For a time, it functioned. There were social events, hunts, a small school, and a community of people trying to maintain English traditions while living on the Canadian frontier. But the prairie is indifferent to class and tradition. The isolation was profound. The winters were brutal in ways that English gentry had not anticipated. Economic opportunities were limited. Young people could not find the same kind of life their parents had hoped for. Gradually, the colony failed. Settlers departed. Families relocated. The dream of creating England in Saskatchewan collapsed. Today, Cannington Manor is a historic site. The foundations of buildings remain. A few structures have been preserved. You can visit and see the detritus of a failed utopian experiment, evidence of people who believed they could transplant their way of life across an ocean and create permanence in an unforgiving landscape. Number 7. Kootenay Lake Ghost Towns, British Columbia. Around the shores of Kootenay Lake in southeastern British Columbia, there are multiple small communities and settlements that once thrived but now are nearly empty. Towns like Caslow were once bustling silver mining communities with hundreds of residents, active mines, busy waterfronts, and the infrastructure of working towns. As the silver market collapsed and as mining operations moved or closed, these communities shrank dramatically. Some, like Caslow, have survived by reinventing themselves as heritage tourism destinations. Others have nearly disappeared. If you take a boat across Kootenay Lake or hike the old trails around its shores, you find the ruins of settlements, the remains of cabins, old docks, rusted mining equipment that were built with the hope they would endure. The lake, beautiful and cold, seems indifferent to the human attempt to build permanence on its shores. Number 6. Port Meunier, Quebec. On the Anticosti Island in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, there is a settlement called Port Meunier that was established in the 1870s and 1880s as a fishing and trading post on the remote island. At its peak, Port Meunier was a functioning community with fishing operations, merchant activity, residences, and the basic infrastructure to support a frontier settlement. The island offered abundant sea resources, fish, seals, and opportunities for trade. Families settled here. They built homes, established stores, conducted business, and created a community on this remote island. But remote islands are inherently fragile as places to build permanent settlements. Transportation is difficult and expensive. Supply chains are vulnerable to weather. Economic opportunities are limited by isolation. As the 20th century progressed and as modern transportation improved, people had options. They could live elsewhere. Young people could leave. Economic activity could relocate. Gradually, Port Meunier declined. Today, it is a small community with a population of a few hundred. It is not a complete ghost town, but it is a shadow of what it once was. A reminder of how settlement in remote places is always contingent on continued economic viability and the willingness of each new generation to stay. Number 5. Beaumont, Saskatchewan. In the prairie region of Saskatchewan, near the village of Zenith, there is an area where you can see the remains of a pioneer settlement and early 20th century homesteading community. Beaumont was established by Ukrainian and European settlers in the early 1900s who came to farm the prairie and build new lives. At its height, Beaumont had homes, a schoolhouse, a grain elevator, and the kind of infrastructure a farming community needs. The settlers came with ambition and determination. They broke the sod, planted crops, raised families, and built a community structure. For decades, Beaumont functioned as a typical prairie settlement. But prairie agriculture is subject to boom and bust cycles. Droughts occur, markets fluctuate, young people migrate to cities, equipment becomes expensive, farms become larger and fewer. The economics of small-scale prairie farming gradually became untenable. Families left, the population dwindled, the schoolhouse closed, the elevator stopped operating. Today, Beaumont is nearly abandoned. A few houses remain, most empty. The grain elevator stands as a monument to a different economic era. The roads are quiet. The prairie has begun its patient work of reclaiming the land. If you visit today, you can see the foundations of homes now overgrown, the weathered remains of farm buildings, and the overwhelming silence of a place where community once existed, but has now largely vanished. Number 4. Yale, British Columbia. During the British Columbia gold rush of the 1850s and 1860s, Yale was one of the most important settlements on the Fraser River. Gold was discovered in the river and surrounding creeks, and fortune seekers flooded into the area. Yale became a major supply center and distribution point for miners heading into the interior. At its busiest, Yale had thousands of residents. There were saloons, supply stores, hotels, gambling operations, and all the rough and tumble commerce of a gold rush town. Fortunes were made and lost. The town was wild, productive, and dynamic. Gold was everywhere, in the river, in nearby creeks, in the dreams of men who came here seeking transformation. But gold rushes are by nature temporary phenomena. The easily accessible gold is found first and extracted quickly. As the easy gold ran out, miners moved deeper into the wilderness, chasing rumors of richer deposits. As the immediate excitement faded, merchants and service providers looked elsewhere. Yale declined as suddenly as it had boomed. By the 1880s, it was a shadow of what it had been. Today, Yale is a small community along the Fraser River. The gold is still there, deep in the earth and locked in the river rocks, but it is not worth extracting at the scale it once was. You can visit Yale and see some remnants of its gold rush past, a few preserved buildings, historical markers, but you stand in a river valley that is quiet now, indifferent to the human dreams that once burned hot here. The river still flows with the same power it always did, but the fortune seekers have moved on, and Yale is a place most people pass through without knowing its story. Number 3. Grand Manan Island Settlements, New Brunswick. On Grand Manan Island in the Bay of Fundy, accessible only by ferry, there are several small settlements that were established by fishing families and maritime workers in the 18th and 19th centuries. These settlements, places with names like Woodward's Cove and Northern Head, were built by people who worked the sea, fishing cod, herring, and lobster. Fishing families developed deep roots here. For generations, the rhythm of the tides and the fishing seasons determined the rhythm of life. At the height of the island's fishing economy, these settlements were thriving communities with active docks, boatyards, fish processing operations, schools, and churches. The sea provided, the families thrived, young people stayed and carried on their parents' work. But fishing, like all resource extraction, is vulnerable to depletion and economic shifts. The fish stocks declined as overfishing took its toll. Technological changes made small-scale fishing less competitive against industrial operations. Young people began to leave, drawn to opportunities on the mainland. The processing operations closed, the boatyards shut down, the schools consolidated and emptied. Today, Grand Manan still has fishing families, but the scale is smaller. Some of the island settlements are nearly empty. A few homes, many of them seasonal residences for people whose families used to live here full-time. The docks are quieter. The sound of maritime work has diminished. What was once the pulse of island life has become something quieter and more melancholic. If you visit the settlements on Grand Manan today, you feel the memory of activity, the echo of work that is no longer done, the presence of families who are no longer there. Number 2. Hillcrest, Alberta. Near the town of Crow's Nest in the Alberta Rockies, there is a coal mining town called Hillcrest that was established in the early 1900s to extract coal from the mountains. Like Bankhead, Hillcrest was built as a company town to house miners and their families. By 1912, Hillcrest had over 2,000 residents. It had modern homes built for miners, schools, churches, shops, recreation facilities, and a sense of permanence and stability. The mine was productive. Coal came out in steady quantities. Families settled. Children were born. The town was built with the confidence that coal mining would sustain it indefinitely. But coal mining is dangerous work, and the industry that powered towns like Hillcrest was exploitative and brutal. In 1914, disaster struck. A massive explosion occurred in the Hillcrest colliery. 189 miners were killed in one of the deadliest mining disasters in Canadian history. The explosion sent shockwaves through the community. Families lost husbands and fathers. The town was in mourning, but worse was what came after. The confidence in the operation was shattered. The company pursued efficiency over safety. The mood in the town changed. Investment declined. By the 1920s and 1930s, as coal demand fell and as the industry mechanized, the Hillcrest mine began to close. Production was scaled back. Families left. The town emptied. Today, Hillcrest is a small community, but it is a shadow of what it was. You can visit the memorial that commemorates the 1914 mining disaster, a stone monument to the men who died, and you stand in a quiet valley where once there was a bustling, terrible, dynamic coal mining town. The Crow's Nest River still flows past. The mountains still stand. But the mines are silent, and the families that made Hillcrest a town are gone. Number 1. The Irish Settlement Disaster, Saskatchewan. In the harsh prairie grasslands of northwestern Saskatchewan, in a region so remote and so difficult that few people today know it exists, there was an attempt in the 1880s and 1890s to establish an Irish settler colony. A group of Irish immigrants, many of them displaced by famine and poverty in Ireland, came to Saskatchewan with the dream of establishing a new Irish community in the Canadian West. They built what became known as the Irish Settlement. Families arrived. They broke the prairie sod. They built sod houses against the relentless wind. They established a small chapel. They tried to create something that would endure. The winters were brutal beyond anything they had experienced in Ireland. The isolation was profound. The land was unforgiving, but they persisted because they had nowhere else to go and nothing else to believe in except the dream that if they could simply endure long enough, the land would become home and yield a living. In the winter of 1888, catastrophe arrived. A sudden, violent blizzard swept across the prairie with a fury that the settlers had not anticipated. The wind was so powerful and the snow so thick that people could not see more than a few feet ahead. People became lost between buildings that were only hundreds of yards apart. Families were separated in the whiteout. Shelter was impossible to reach. In the space of hours, the blizzard killed scores of settlers. Children died. Parents died searching for children. Elderly settlers froze in the attempt to reach the chapel for shelter. The settlement was devastated. The psychological impact was catastrophic. Survivors were traumatized. The realization that the prairie itself was an enemy that could not be fought, only endured or fled, became undeniable. In the aftermath, most survivors left. They abandoned the settlement and migrated to areas where winters were less severe and where the isolation was less complete. Within a decade, the Irish settlement was abandoned. What remained was scattered ruins, the depressions of sod houses, the remains of the small chapel, and the graves of those who had died in the blizzard and never received a proper burial. For over a century, the Irish settlement faded from memory. Few people in Saskatchewan even knew it had existed. The prairie reclaimed the land. Winds blew across empty grassland where children had once played. The graves weathered and their markers faded. Today, the Irish settlement is one of Canada's most forgotten disasters. There is no grand monument. There is no major highway marker. There is no museum. What exists is a remote patch of Saskatchewan prairie where the grass grows over the graves of people who came seeking hope and found only death. If you visit today, and few do, because it is so remote that it requires determined effort to reach, you stand in an empty grassland and try to imagine the screams of a blizzard, the desperation of families separated by white, the cold that no amount of determination could survive. The prairie has its memory of what happened here, even if the people who live in Saskatchewan have largely forgotten. The Irish settlement remains the most complete disappearance in Canadian history, not just of a town, but of an entire dream, erased by weather and geography and the fundamental hostility of the land to human presence. I hope you have found this journey through Canada's forgotten places as haunting as I did. Make sure to share this video with your friends, and I'll see you in the next one.